Hey guys, this is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to create a blog using ASP.NET MVC in C# and then slugify the URLs. When you create a normal MVC application, in general you have controllers and you have actions, and an action can have some parameters. That's a playing field we get out of the box with MVC. So if we would create our blog using regular MVC, we would get a URL like blog/article/1. This of course works, but it's not very readable, nor is it fancy looking. The goal is to make somebody interested enough to potentially read your blog article. In a lot of places, you only see the URL and no title or description. And I would not be very motivated to click on a blog which states blog/article/231. It's also quite error prone. If somebody copies it by mistake and then changes it to 232, it might be a whole different article, or it might not even exist. So first, I could try to change the ID to something more readable, like a string. Like for instance, this is my first blog post. It's still not very sexy, but at least it's readable. And so my URL would look now like blog/article/this is my first blog post. Even though this looks more readable, as a developer, we know this isn't a valid URL. To make a valid URL, we need to replace the spaces by %20 for each of the spaces. And that again makes our URL quite less readable. So in comes Slugify. It's a process to convert a string or a title or a phrase into URL-friendly format, which one calls a slug. It's also quite SEO-friendly. So in today's video, I'm going to do the following things. I'll first cover a basic MVC application, wherein I will explain the minimum plumbing to have my blog site up and running. I won't be connecting to any database of that sort. Everything will be just hard-coded, since it's a POC. So my first version will return blog/article/ID. In my second version, I'll convert it to a general slugify using convention-based routing. In my third version, I'll use attribute-based routing instead of convention-based routing for slugification. And then finally, I'll return to convention-based routing and make a mixture between dates and slugs. So let's get into it. So this is the first version of our blog website. As you can see, we have a blog controller, we have our default index page, which returns the list of blog posts. Currently, we have 5 hard-coded blog posts. And if I float over the URLs, as you can see, we have blog/article1, 2, 3, etc. If I click through, you can see in the URL we have blog/article/2, and then we specify or show our current blog post. Now let's dig into code. So if we look at our project, what do we have? We have controllers, we have a model, we have our processors, which is our business layer, we have view models, since we're in model view controller, we have our views, and we have our program starter point. The most important class for this project here is the blog post model. In its POC form, it contains an ID, a title, a post, and a creation date. Of course, in a real-life application, we would also have something like a publishing date if you want to schedule, tags, a preview, images, the creator, etc. You get the point. Next step, we have our blog processor, which is the business layer which is responsible for retrieving our blogs. Since we don't have any data layer here present, we hard-code everything, and I've created a generate blog listing method, where I've hard-coded each of my blog posts. As a good practice, there's a separation between controllers, business layer, and data layer. And so, my blog processor has an interface, iBlog processor, which allows me to use IOC throughout. So how does this magic sauce happen? Well, if you go to the programs file, in here we add a transient object where we associate the iBlog processor to the blog processor. I will go into more detail in IOC, mocking, unit testing, etc. But you get the point. We can easily replace the iBlock processor with the block processor, should we want to. As you can also see, we have a default map controller route, which defaults our route and our conventions, where we have the controller, we have the action, and we have an optional ID. The default action is index, and the default controller is home. Currently, we leave that in place because it suits us well. We have a separation, a minimum home controller, and then we have a block controller. So let's dig into the home controller. Our home controller is quite basic. We have a constructor, we have our index, and currently the index is only doing redirect to the index of the block controller. And then we have an error handling action. I have extended it quite a lot compared to the default error handling action. Error handling in general is quite important. However, since this is a POC, I want to see as much as error information on screen. In a real-life application, however, you want to show as little information as possible to the end user or to the hacker. But you want to lock as much as possible to your own system, so in case of hacking or some bugs, you have enough information to know what's going wrong. Next off, we have the block controller. It's quite basic. We have a constructor, we have our index, and we have our article. As you can see, in our constructor, we receive the iBlock processor, and so we can mock this should we need to, and this is our entry point to our business layer. Then we have the index method, which is your default home page. So as you can see, my index page currently calls the generate blog post listing and returns all the blog posts. However, in a real life situation, you might have hundreds or even thousands of blog posts, and you don't want to display them all at once on your first page. It's too time consuming and that's too much information, which isn't really needed. So you'll have to implement paging, taking the last 10, etc., implementing some search algorithms and whatever to make it more performant. And then finally, we have our article, which is a basic search based on ID. It retrieves again all blog posts, and depending on that, it does a search and a link query to find the matching ID. If the ID isn't matched, we just return to our index page. If not, we open our blog post. Then next we have our view models. I created a basic view model with just some title information. Then I have my specific home error view model, which contains all possible error information for displaying. Then I have my blog post index view model, which just simply contains the list of the blog posts. And I have my blog article view model, which contains the specific post. Now here I made a clear distinction between our blog post model and our blog post view model. The view model is something specifically created for a view. Currently, this is a very simple application and I only have the list of blog post models. In a real-life application, of course, I might have paging information and other information necessary for the page to display correctly. That's why there's a clear separation. And finally, I have my views. First, I have my index page. In here, I have a simple for each throughout my blog posts. And then in there, I have a URL action where I call my article on my block controller and my ID equals my post ID. And based on this information, it correctly builds me the URL to click through. The article CSHTML file is quite simple. I display the title, the creation date, and the post. Then I have the error page, which just displays the maximum information. I have my layout and some plumbing, and that makes it my first working MVC blog post website. Now we have our second version, the conventional slugified version. At first sight, you don't see anything different. We still land on our block controller, we still have links, and nothing looks different, right? Well, if I float over the URLs, something has changed. Now you clearly see we don't have blog/article 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but now we have blog/my first post, my second post, etc. If I click through, again in the URL, you see I have blog, my first post, second, etc. So now let's dig in the code to see what has changed. At first glance, we still have controllers, models, processors, view models, views, a program, and still no data layer. There is some MVC page friendly helper. Now let's look at the blog post model. So here we have first a major page in order to make this happen. Next to the title, we have a slug property. And then I've created a static make-friendly URL to encapsulate the process for creating my slugified URLs. If I go back to my processor, which creates hard-coded my blog post, here next to the title, my slug is also filled in. And it simply calls my blog post model make-friendly URL static function. As you can see here, I pass the title twice, first in the title and then in the helper method. The way this is structured, I cannot really reuse my title property to feed my slug. But in a real-life application where you will have an edit page, you will only have one title field, and when we save, we will save both to the title and to the slug. So that's not really an issue. Now let's look at my helper class, the friendly URL helper. It is responsible for building my slug. With a little bit of help of my AI versions, I was able to build this. However, there are some NuGet packages which do exactly the same thing. Let's look what has changed in our controller. Our home controller stays exactly the same. However, our blog controller is modified. First, the index stays the same. I have introduced another action, site index, and I'll come back to that later. And as you can see, the article has been modified from an ID to an article. And the link query has been modified from ID to slug, where the slug search for an article. If I don't find anything, I still go to my index page. If not, I return my blog post. So what has changed and how does this magic now happen? Well, it's twofold. At first, if I go to the blog processor, I create my slugs, and so I define the URLs which are listable. But in order to make this happen, I need to change my program.css and I need to tweak a little bit my map controller routes. So if you compare with the previous sample, we still have our default, which has controller home, which has action, and which has an optional ID. The second one, and the most important here, is the map controller route for our blog article. And this is a catch-all function. So everything that comes after the blog is automatically redirected to our blog controller and to our action method. And so if you only have those two, and we go back to our blog controller, everything that comes in here will be treated by this. For our index, in general, if we have nothing, or if we don't find a match, well, that's not much of an issue, because if he doesn't find anything in his query, it will automatically redirect to the index. However, it's not so clean. And so I have defined two extra specific functions. Technically, next to the blog, I should also define a third one, blog/index, because if I just type /blog, I will have a redirect to my blog controller and my index method. But if I type blog/index, I will still fall in my article case, and if we go back to the blog controller, I will still not be found and be redirected this way. And then finally, as a proof of concept as well, I've introduced a notion of site index. In general, websites have something like robots.txt, which is something which is read by search engines. And in the robots.txt file, we can specify where a search engine needs to search in order to find all its necessary information. So I created a site index which could be added to our robots.txt file, and the responsibility of the site index action would be to return the whole list of all available blog posts in a specific XML format. Now if we go back to the blog controller, I just entered my entry point. I have my site index, and here in my current implementation, I just return a dummy page which returns the count. And since this sample is not really about the site index and robot.txt, this is just a proof of concept to prove that next to my blog catch-all, I'm still able to return my site index page. So if I go back to the website, next to my blog, if I type site index, it simply returns me a page which shows I have 5 blog posts. In order to have that site index page, I also had to create a site index view model which just contains a count. I had to create a site index HTML file which just returns the model count, and that's about it. Now if we go back to the index page, the tweak I had to do here is very minor. I still have my URL action. I still return to my article action on my block controller, and I've replaced my ID by my article and my post by my slug. My article is a string and is the entry method for my article string, and that way automatically, in combination with this block article, it knows how to translate. And so by having those minor tweaks, I converted my MVC basic application to an MVC application that supports slugs. So now we have our third version of our block website, the attribute-based routing one. It's completely different, right? Well, not really. There's just some minor details. For those who watch out, we don't have /block with lower capital B, but block with upper capital B, and it shows index. Other than that, if we float over the URLs, we still have my first post, my second post, etc. When we click through, we still have the same thing, with the exception that block is put into uppercase. If I put it to lower, it works as well. Now let's add the site index, and it's working as well. Now let's dig into the code. So everything has changed, right? Well, not really. We still have our controllers, we still have our helper method, we still have the processors, we still have view models, we still have views, and we still have a program. So let's dig into the program first. So what has changed here? Well, instead of having the map controllers route, we just have a map controllers default. And that's it. There's no squeaky little rules here anymore. We just have default behavior. So how does the app then knows where to go? Well, we switch to attribute-based routing. Let's first look at the home controller. In here, we have two routes. We have a default controller. We could hard-code it as well home, but we could just take the generic controller method. If we hard-code it as home, it might translate to lowercase. However, from my point of view, it's better to have a generic controller method. And then we have a default route in order to have our first slash working. Then we have our index. Here we specify both the index as well as, again, the default blank. And then we had to define our error. Compared to the other one, here you clearly see everything explicitly specifies HTTP GET. For this kind of application, since everything is GET, at this point, there's no issue. Now let's look at the block controller. What do we have here? Again, we defined route as controller, but we could define explicitly block. If I would like to have my uppercase block to lowercase block, a possibility would be here to specify block in lower cases, and that would change. Let's show you. So I put into comment my controller, I temporarily named it block, and I start it up. And as you can see here now, our block is in lower cases. Let's revert this. If you want to get rid of index, again by treating the attributes, we also can get rid of it. Let's do that. So in order to get rid of index, we just have to comment this one out. And now as you can see, it's completely the same as before. If we try out /index, it still works. So it really depends how detailed you want to be and how explicit or controlling you want to be, or if that's an issue. For the upper and lower cases, in the next sample, we will still see another solution to that. Now let's revert back to the initial one. And then here we have our site index, which is also a get. And then finally we have our slug, which is just defined between curly brackets, which translate to the article, and nothing else changed. And so we made an easy conversion from convention-based routing to attribute-based routing. So we've already seen convention-based routing, we've already seen attribute-based routing. In this sample, I'll dig a little deeper in some extra possibilities by using convention-based routing. On the internet, when doing my research, I found a lot of examples for slugifying, which try to use the add controllers with view and specify some extra conventions. Using those conventions, there's two techniques. There's one technique which I'll describe now for the convention-based routing, and there's the other one for the attribute-based routing. So in essence, our MVC already has a convention. The base convention is controller, action, and ID. If we define an explicit custom convention, we can do something else for whatever we choose. If we want to tweak the convention-based routing, we need to specify an extra class which implements the iApplication model conversion. So in essence, at startup, the apply method will loop through all our available controllers. For each of these controllers, it will loop through all of the available actions, and here, depending on whatever you want to do in the code, an action name can be translated to a slug. This can also be used if you want to modify our actions and to have language-specific actions. So some samples put this forward as a requirement in order to achieve slugification. It's true and it's not true. By using this technique, we can slugify controllers and/or actions. However, specifically for our block controller, in essence, we have one controller, which is our block controller. We have one method, which is the article method, and that's it. And then all our URLs are custom built. However, this iApplication model converter apply is only applied at startup, only once. And so our blog posts are not known there. So this sample, even though I've included to show you what's possible, is not at all relevant for our blog posts. So in order to show what is possible, I created a new controller. I created a controller, subscription management controller, which is two words, both with a capital. And so by applying this on that controller, the URL will change from subscription management to subscription-management. In the subscription management controller, I have a method, list all, and that will be translated to list-all. So let's show. At startup now, I simply added to my default page very simple extra URL. And if you float over it, you can clearly see that subscription management has been modified to subscription-management. List all has been modified to list-all. And if I click through, it lands on this page with a simple OK. So if we now look at the index page where I defined that, in here we just have an href with URL action, with my list all, and my subscription management without dashes, which is automatically translated to the correct URL. Now let's put a breakpoint and let's see how the startup runs the Slugify controller action convention. So at startup, before anything is shown, it loops through controllers. As you can see, I have 3 controllers. And if we come to the relevant controller, first our controller is slugified, then it loops through the actions. Our action is also slugified, the previous actions are cleared, and the new slugified action is added. And that's it for this modification. The second possible tweak we have here is to play around with the add routing settings. First, we can define the lowercase URLs, which forces our URLs to be always returned lowercase. Since in essence MVC is never case sensitive, it's just something that can be handy when we display URL, nothing more, nothing less. The second one, constraint map, allows us to put certain constraints on certain specific properties. In essence, by default, that's used, for instance, if you put a constraint on something like an ID, which has to be int or long, or a GUID, which has to be validated as a validated GUID. Here, I have specified my slug constraint, which is a specific class which implements the iRoute constraint and then allows me to run whatever I want. Since initially, in my sample, I already built my slugs through a helper function, there won't really be an issue. However, this is a filter that allows us to pre-validate parameters that come in, should we want to. Now, adding this to the program is not sufficient. We need to explicitly, after the article, also going to specify my slug. And the slug here is my constraint map. Now let's put a breakpoint on that. When I now start up my code and it tries to fill in my initial page, of course it builds each of those URLs. And so every time I will hit my validation to see that my pre-generated slug is valid. My first, my second, my third, my fourth, and my fifth. When I then click on one, again, it validates whether or not what I put into URL is a validated slug. So there might be situations where this is handy. That's up to you. I just wanted to show that this is possible. So in line with the convention extra, I have also a routing extra. And here again, it's the same logic. First, again, we're going to use the convention, but this time Since we're using attribute-based routing, we have to use the route token transform convention, wherein I've created a slugified parameter transformer, which needs to explicitly implement the outbound parameter. Again, this is totally useless in our scenario, since we have one blog controller, one article method, and our blog posts are not known at startup and are not actions. But again, I have made the same implementation. We have our subscription management controller, this time through attribute routing. I have defined our route controller, I have defined the action method, and if we play this sample, when I hit the breakpoint, I receive my value, which is subscription manager, and it will be transformed to subscription-manager. Same thing for list all, and it'll be transformed to list all. And when I run it, again, we have our list all, which is translated to subscription-manager list all. And again, we return a simple OK, and we have a URL of subscription management and list all. So our same sample as before works using attribute-based routing, but is not really relevant in the blog scenario. And the second and final, and here next to our @routing and our constraint map, we also have the lowercase URLs. If you remember, when introducing attribute-based routing, going back to the blog controller, and instead of using an explicitly blog here, but rather the controller, and since blog started with a capital B, and same for index, by using the lower cases, if I now start, out of the blocks, blog is with lowercase, index is with lowercase. And if we want to get rid of index, we still need to remove the HTTP get index to get the same result as before. If we go back to the constraint map, again, we have specified the slug here, and on the blog controller, next to our slug parameter, we need to specify the slug type in order for this to function. Let's put some breakpoint. It's exactly the same class as before. And so for each parameter, it will hit and it will do the necessary validation. Again, it's up to you if you need to validate this and introduce this into your code or not. And then finally, we have our date convention-based Slugify sample. So what is different? Page looks the same. We have a blog controller. We have a number of static posts. However, if you float over it, you can clearly see we now have a URL, which is blog/2025/5/my first post, my second post, etc., etc. And so we've included the year and the month, and that corresponds with the date. The URL is well working. So let's look into detail what has changed. Let's first look at our program class. In here, our blog article, well, we've added a year, which is of type integer, a month, which is of type integer, and then still our article. If you go to the blog controller, we've added year and month, and in our search, we've also added year and month. If you go to the index page, here again, we've added our article, our year, and our month. And this is all we really need to modify to also have a year and a month in our URLs. So as you've seen, creating the start of your own blog website isn't that hard as it seems. Well, at least not for the URL part. Of course, there's loads of other things that would need to be done in order to have a functioning blog website. When comparing different POCs, if I compare convention-based routing and attribute-based routing, they're as good as the same. It's more a matter of choice or style. The first centralizes things more, the second defines it closer to the controller. Convention-based routing, in general, is more something for apps, while attribute-based routing is more used in REST application or APIs. On the other hand, adding year, month, and or day is a whole different discussion. The pros of using Slugify only is that you can't really see how old an article is. The URLs tend to be shorter. However, sometimes you might need to be a lot more creative in order to have a unique URL. And you really don't know which URL from which article comes first. Say you write an article, for instance, the best ... for ... and you wrote it 2 years ago. And then last year, you want to update that article. Well, you could just replace the first and keep the same URL. Or you could create a new version, the best ... for ... specify the year. Maybe the slugify only approach for a blog is better suited if your number of articles are rather limited. But then again, it's a matter of choice. The pros of using the year, month and or day is that you can clearly see from the URL when something was written. The downside is that the URLs are much longer. However, SEOs can benefit because it's more structured. The downside is you can't just modify an article and you need to create a new one with a new date. Maybe that's a good thing. Also, if you only post from time to time, people will notice much faster the frequency at which you post, which is low or high, and or determine the age of your article. Independently of both choices, some people say it's better not to use dates in URLs or the post itself, because it might be a disadvantage because of the search engines. Personally, when I come into contact with a new article, the first thing I try to do is to find the publish date and or see whether or not this article or content is still relevant or might already be obsolete. For tech articles, but also for other articles, that might be an issue. So when trying to create my own blog site, I'll be making other videos along the way. You can find a source code on GitHub in the link down below. If you guys enjoyed this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.